All right, today we're taking an updated look at the RTX 4060 series of graphics cards. So that includes the 4060, 4060 Ti, 8GB, and the 16GB versions. But pause on the benchmarks for just a second. It's important to think about how much these graphics cards cost in the current market, because none of them cost their original MSRPs. If I wanted to buy an RTX 4060 today, brand new, it would cost me as low as $285, but go up from there, which is down from the original MSRP of $300. But if I wanted to buy myself a 4060 Ti, it would be at least $370, go up from there, but that's lower than the original MSRP of $400. Now, the 16GB version of the 4060 Ti that released later increases the price to at least $432 and quickly goes up from there, but that is down from its original launch price of $500. So if we want to look at it from a price perspective, buying the 4060 Ti 8GB instead of the 4060 increases the price by about 30%. However, if you went ahead and bought the 16GB 4060 Ti instead of the 4060, you're increasing your price by about 52%. So you're paying a lot more money for the Ti versions. Now, some of you will be wondering, okay, what about comparing against the AMD competition? The good news is I have separate videos doing that. I've looked at the 4060 Ti 8GB and 16GB against the 7700 XT and also the 7800 XT, which is a better price competitor against the 4060 Ti 16GB. And I've looked at the 4060 up against cards like the 7600, the 6700 XT, and 7600 XT closer price competitors. Anyway, let's go ahead and say if you're focused on the 4060 series, which according to Steam charts and all of that, a lot of people are interested in, let's look at how they stack up in the latest games and against each other. So I'm going to go ahead and make myself tiny and out of the way unless I have something big to talk about. Keep rolling the benchmarks. Here we're looking at Horizon Forbidden West at 1080p very high settings, and we are seeing that the 4060 Ti 8GB is 19% faster than the 4060, but the 16GB version is 30% faster. And if you look at the 1% lows, the 16GB version is doing way better than the others. What's going on here? We're going beyond 8GB of VRAM when we use the very high settings, even at 1080p in Horizon Forbidden West. So whenever the 16GB version performs better than the 8GB version by a noticeable margin, that means at those graphic settings, 8GB of VRAM is causing issues, because otherwise they would perform about the same. So let's keep rolling the benchmarks, and we'll take a look at how this stacks up at a whole bunch of other graphic settings, because you don't have to play at the very high settings. If we went ahead and turned down to the high settings, notice that now the 8 and 16GB versions of the 4060 Ti are performing very, very similarly, so it's more down to run-to-run variants and different cooler models, whereas they're both about 20% faster than the 4060. Again, they cost more than 20% more, so it's certainly indicating the value proposition goes to the non-Ti version of the 4060. What if you wanted to play at 1440p? Well, at very high settings, the only card reaching 60 FPS or better here is the 16GB version, giving it a 39% advantage over the 44 frames per second that we're seeing on the 4060. And the 4060 Ti 8GB is coming in at 54 frames per second. But again, looking at the 1% lows and the stutters on the frame time graph, the very high settings in this game caused issues for 8GB cards. However, if we move down to the high settings at 1440p, the game still looks very similar, but now our performance goes up on the 8GB cards, but not much on the 16GB card, indicating this is mostly just reigning in VRAM. The 4060 Ti is now 24% faster than the 4060 at 63 FPS versus 51, and the 8 and 16GB cards are mostly tied, a little different in the 1% lows. Another option would be to use DLSS upscaling, which at the quality setting at 1440p looks very good, and this now boosts the 4060 up to 68 frames per second, but the 4060 Ti takes 82 FPS, giving it a 21% advantage over the 4060, and the 16 16GB card coming in about the same, 1 frame per second faster, so it looks like 8GB of VRAM is not an issue at those settings. Let's move on to Ghost of Tsushima. At 1080p very high settings in this game, I don't seem to be seeing any indication of 8GB of VRAM causing issues, since our 8GB and 16GB cards are performing about the same on the TI models here at 84 FPS average. The 4060 comes in at 69, nice, which gives the TI cards a 22% advantage over the non-TI 4060. If we move up to 1440p resolution, the TI cards are able to average just under 60 FPS at 58, whereas the 4060 non-TI is coming in at 48 frames per second. It's a 21% advantage for the 4060 Ti. So this is an example of a game where you could play at the max settings at around 60 FPS on the TI cards, but not on the non-TI cards. However, again, you can play around with graphic settings. What if we went to DLSS quality, but kept the very high settings? Well, here we're seeing the 4060 now jump to 71 frames per second, so you're getting a pretty good experience, although the 8GB TI card is hitting 82 FPS and the 16GB hitting 85 FPS. Some small differences there for the 16GB card, but it's nothing major, indicating that 8GB of VRAM is probably not a big deal here or anything. And if we go ahead and what if we just drop to high settings rather than using upscaling? That's another way that the 4060 non-TI can hit 60 FPS average, although the TI cards hit 69 and 71, respectively, giving them 15 and 18% advantages over the 4060 non-TI card, although all of them, again, are delivering a good experience in this game with 60 FPS or better. What if we move to the latest Unreal Engine 5 showcase game with Hellblade 2: Senua's Saga, and at 1080p high settings, which is the highest setting preset in the game. It doesn't go up to Ultra or Epic or anything like that. None of the cards average 60 FPS, even at 1080p. With the TI cards coming in at 55, giving them a 28% lead over the 4060 non-TI, which is hitting a 43 frames per second average. However, if you reduce down to medium settings, the 4060 increases to 60 frames per second, and the TI cards increase to 72 and 73 respectively, giving them a 20 to 22% advantage over the 4060 non-TI. We also don't see any indication that 8GB of VRAM is an issue, since we're within 1 FPS of each other on our 8 and 16GB 4060 Ti's. It's kind of nice to have them here to check for whether VRAM is an issue. If we move up to 1440p resolution at the high settings, there's some indication that 8GB of VRAM, we might be like right on that borderline, because the 16GB card is doing a little better than the 8GB card, but by 2 FPS in the averages and 3 in the 1% lows, so not anything too crazy. But none of the cards are doing great here, so this probably isn't how you would play the game at 30, 37, and 39 FPS respectively. So if we move to using DLSS quality at 1440p high, the TI cards are now hitting 57 FPS average, and they're now tied perfectly. So it's if there was a VRAM issue with 8GB, using DLSS seems to have reduced that and leveled things out, and the 4060 non-TI is hitting 48 FPS average, which honestly in this game is probably fine because it's so slow paced, but you still might want to chase a higher frame rate. If you reduce to medium settings, we get to 43 FPS on the 4060 and 52 and 53 FPS respectively on the 4060 Ti cards. So no indication that there's any major difference in VRAM. 1 FPS difference is likely run-to-run variance or different cooler models on the GPUs, that type of a thing. But again, we're still not hitting 60 frames per second. But what if we use DLSS quality while on the medium graphics preset? This goes ahead and boosts the 4060 over 60 FPS, hitting 65. The 4060 Ti 8GB takes a 12% lead at 73 FPS, and the 16GB card hits 75 frames per second. So here, this is probably the settings that I think a lot of people would end up using on these GPUs to get a good frame rate. But not every Unreal Engine 5 game is as demanding as Hellblade 2. If we take a look at like an earlier Unreal Engine 5 game like RoboCop Rogue City, at 1080p epic settings, which is the maximum settings in this game, we see the 4060 hitting 56 FPS average, with the TI versions hitting 69 nice and 70 respectively, 23 and 25% ahead on average. But you could go up to 1440p, where the Epic settings are not hitting 60 FPS. Here, the 4060 is at 37 FPS, and the TI cards are hitting 46 and 47 respectively, giving them a 24% and 27% advantage respectively over the 4060. But all three cards are falling well short of the types of frame rates that you'd probably want to be hitting in a first-person shooter style game. But as tends to be the case, Unreal Engine 5 performance-wise responds very well to upscaling, so using DLSS quality, the TI cards are now hitting 70 frames per second on average, with the Epic preset as a baseline. And the 4060 is almost hitting 60 FPS. It's hitting 57. So it's a 23% lead for the 4060 Ti cards. Now, this game does feature frame generation, so you could be able to kick that on off of the 60 FPS baseline and get a pretty good experience for motion fluidity. But let's move on to Starfield. At 1080p ultra settings, the TI cards are able to average 60 FPS and 61 respectively, whereas the 4060 non-TI is only hitting 48, unable to get a 60 FPS average at maxed out 1080p settings in this game. But we don't have to play at those settings, but let's go ahead and look at 1440p. And at 1440p ultra settings, none of them are hitting a 60 FPS average, with 38 FPS on the 4060 and 48 and 49 respectively on the TI 8 and 16 gigabyte cards. So probably not the settings that you would use here. So again, you could reduce performance settings. You could also use upscaling settings. The game also has frame generation. Here, I chose to take a look at DLSS quality off of the ultra settings as a baseline, which gets our TI cards to 60 FPS and the 4060 non-TI hitting 49 FPS, and the 16 gigabyte card taking 61 FPS. So anyway, again, from this point, you could turn settings down further while using the upscaling on the original 4060, or you could also use frame generation. There's a lot of ways you could go, but let's get some more game tests in. How about Resident Evil 4 Remake? Take a look at the 8 gigabyte card's massive stutters on the frame time graphs up here. 8 gigabytes of VRAM is not enough for max settings in this game, even at 1080p resolution, even though performance-wise, the GPUs could handle this. Look at the 1% lows. It's an absolute disaster for the 8 gigabyte cards, whereas the 16 gigabyte card cruises through easily. Whereas if we move down to the prioritized graphics settings, the VRAM usage declines to under 8 gigabytes, and our cards all jump up in performance, as well as having smooth frame time graphs with good 1% lows. Here we're seeing the 4060 at 110 FPS average and the 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte TI cards hitting 140 and 142 respectively. So good performance from all of them at those settings. At 1440p, again, the maximum settings are causing VRAM related stuttering on the 8 gigabyte cards, whereas the 16 gigabyte card is perfectly smooth. So the 1% lows are a disaster single-digit numbers on the 4060 and 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, whereas the average performance is actually reasonable on all of them. It's a bad experience on the 8 gigabyte cards. If we go to prioritize graphics preset, we see all of the cards doing well, and the frame time graphs are smooth. So again, 8 gigabytes is fine on the prioritized graphics preset. We see the 4060 hitting 72 FPS average, whereas the TI cards are hitting 95 and 96 respectively. The 1% lows are looking good as well at 65, 86, and 87 respectively. Let's go ahead and check out some more games. What if you wanted to play some Call of Duty Modern Warfare 3 and you're chasing a high refresh rate, so you turn down to basic graphics settings? Well, the 4060 is good for 171 average in the built-in benchmark, and the TI cards are good for 217 and 220 respectively. And even the 1% lows are over 100 FPS on all three cards. So you can definitely get a good experience in this game. And at 1440p, you're getting 123 FPS average on the 4060, and the TI cards are getting 157 and 156 respectively, so about 28% faster. Don't read too much into a 1 FPS difference between the 8 and 16 gigabyte models. And so all the GPUs are doing well here, and you could even use upscaling on the 1440p basic settings if you wanted even higher performance. But let's move on to something like, how about path tracing in Cyberpunk? Well, even at 1080p using DLSS quality upscaling, we're not getting a great experience from the 4060 at 38 FPS, and the 8GB 4060 Ti is only hitting 42. The 16GB Ti card is doing a lot better at 52, indicating that 8GB of VRAM isn't really enough even at 1080p and even using DLSS quality. If you kick on frame generation on top of using the DLSS quality upscaling and the RT Overdrive preset here, now the cards are doing better in the averages, especially the 16GB card, indicating once again that 8GB of VRAM wasn't really ideal here. The 1% lows are especially lower and spikier looking frame time graphs on the 8GB cards. If we just move down to ultra settings rather than using ray tracing, now all of the cards are giving you a good experience at 1080p and don't require any kind of upscaling or frame generation to get you there, with the 4060 hitting 75 FPS average and the Ti cards hitting 95 and 97 respectively. The frame time graphs look fairly smooth and there's no disasters in the 1% lows. Let's go ahead and take a look at 1440p, where at the ultra settings, we see that none of the cards break 60 FPS in the built-in benchmark, and the 4060 is hitting 45 FPS, the 4060 Ti 8GB hitting 55, and the 16GB hitting 57. So these really probably aren't the settings you would use here then, although you could, there's a lot of options for what you could try out here. I like going down to the high preset in Cyberpunk, which still looks quite good, and the 4060 is now hitting 55 FPS, so you're not quite where you might want to be. If you kick on DLSS quality on top of this, it helps out a lot. And the 4060 Ti 8 and 16GB cards are hitting 69, nice, and 70 respectively, so they're in pretty good shape here. Again, you could try using frame generation, DLSS quality, all sorts of options to boost performance further, but let's go ahead and take a look at Alan Wake 2. This is another path tracing title, and even at 1080p, with DLSS quality upscaling, so we're only at a 720p internal rendering resolution, none of the cards are doing great here, especially not the 4060, which is below a 30 FPS average. So really just not a great experience with path tracing on these graphics cards. If you just play at the high settings without kicking on the RT high, and you don't upscale, so you're at a full native 1080p, we're now getting a better experience, but it's still only 46 FPS on the 4060. This is a pretty slow-paced game. But the 4060 Ti 8GB hitting 56 and the 16GB doing a bit better at 61. So it's possible that 8GB isn't quite enough for full performance at the high settings, even at 1080p in Alan Wake 2. At 1440p high settings, none of the GPUs are doing great. The 4060 is below a 30 FPS average at 29, and the frame time graphs looking very spiky. The 4060 Ti 8GB doing a lot better at 37 FPS, but still not a great experience. And the 4060 Ti 16GB hitting 41, again indicating that 8GB of VRAM is not giving you full performance in this title. If you kick on DLSS quality upscaling on 1440p high, now the 16GB 4060 Ti is able to hit 64 FPS, whereas the 8GB card's only hitting 54. Once again, indicating some level of VRAM spillover on the 8GB cards at these settings. The 4060 is hitting 46 FPS. Again, you don't need a super high frame rate in this game. So again, you could kick on frame generation, turn settings down to medium or low, but that's a ton of games tested at 1080p and 1440p at a variety of graphic settings with upscaling on and off. So what conclusions do we make about the 4060 lineup stacked up against itself? Well, I mean, if price wasn't factored in, if money was no object, then the 4060 Ti 16GB is obviously nice to have. We see numerous indications of games that could otherwise perform reasonably well, having their performance hampered, especially with spikes in the frame time graph and issues in the 1% lows, giving you a more stuttery experience on the 8GB products. That being said, you can always turn down graphic settings to a point where the 8GB works just fine, but it would be really nice to not have to do that. And again, we saw even at 1080p in multiple titles, indications that the 8GB of VRAM was underperforming versus 16. So it would be nice to just say, grab yourself the 16GB product. It's great. The problem was the price. The price at $432, again, versus the 4060, just 8 gigabyte and non-TI at $285, you're paying 52% more money roughly for what's usually only 20% to 20 to 30% more performance when VRAM's not an issue. So if you're looking at these percentage differences, again, you can see it balloon to some massive leads when VRAM becomes an issue. But when it's not an issue, it's usually, again, only 20, 25% faster, somewhere around there, right? In fact, oftentimes, the 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte 4060 Ti's perform exactly the same as each other, which is what happens when you're not trying to use more than 8 gigabytes of VRAM. So in other words, when you're adjusting your graphic settings to be appropriate to 8 gigabytes, the 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabytes don't end up mattering, and performance-wise, it's only like a 25-ish% advantage, 20 to 25, kind of depending on the exact situation. But again, you're paying 52% more money. So this is one of those situations where I just don't honestly like any of these graphics cards. They do reach performance numbers at the correct settings that are perfectly playable at both 1080p and 1440p, again, using reasonable graphic settings and upscaling, at 1440p quality. So again, I think if you buy any of these, you're going to have a decent experience in any of the latest titles if you use appropriate settings. But it's just like, I don't like any of them because the 8 gigabyte cards are clearly having to deal with that, and it's a bit of a headache, and the 16 gigabyte card is just massively overpriced. I will throw in that the 16 gigabyte card has a use case outside of gaming that could be compelling for a lot of people, where a lot of productivity workloads, especially AI models and things like that, like to have a big VRAM buffer. And also a lot of them work best on NVIDIA GPUs, which means that if you want a 16 gigabyte NVIDIA GPU, the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte suddenly actually has a use case. And that's probably why it's able to command the price point that it does, just due to that interesting, application. But my videos are based on gaming, and so for gaming, I just think it's massively overpriced, and so I would much rather just tweak graphic settings on a much better deal, although I'd rather not have to tweak the graphic settings at all, which is why I'd recommend that you check out some of my other videos where I compare these graphics cards against their AMD competition. For the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte, the 7800 XT costs $460. So it's like less than a $30 price increase to get a 16 gigabyte graphics card that is just massively more powerful than the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte. So look at my recent head-to-head video of the 7800 XT against the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte to get an idea of whether it might make sense to go with the AMD product at a similar price point and similar VRAM amount for a lot more rasterized performance. And it even wins in the lighter ray tracing workloads due to just having such a lead overall. And if you're worried about upscaling, it has such a big performance lead that oftentimes even upscaling with the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte at 1440p DLSS quality oftentimes only ties or sometimes falls a little short of tying the 7800 XT just running at native resolution. So definitely look into that comparison if you're considering the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte. And if you're considering the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte, again, I have some recent comparison videos against the 7700 XT from AMD, which is available as low as $360 right now. And again, the 4060 Ti 8 gigabyte right now is coming in at $370. So these are direct price competitors, but the AMD product has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so you're less likely to be worried about tweaking the graphics settings to adjust for the VRAM amount, and it also has just more raw performance overall. Although in the heavier ray tracing workloads it can fall behind, and DLSS upscaling does look better than FSR upscaling. So I'll say that this one is less of a complete blowout than the 7800 XT against the 4060 Ti 16 gigabyte, but I still think I'd prefer this product personally. over the 4060 Ti 8GB. And there's also, if you live in the correct regions, the 6800 16GB card from the previous generation from AMD is still available brand new for $340, costing less than all of them, and it actually performs about the same as the 7700 XT while having 4 more gigabytes of VRAM, and literally double what the 4060 Ti 8GB has. So again, check my head-to-head videos on that one. And the 4060, the main thing it has going for it is it costs under $300. So I'm more forgiving of the 8GB product, except for the fact that cards like the 6750 XT from AMD from the previous generation are still available with 12 gigabytes of VRAM, more overall performance, and coming in actually at about the same price, $280 right now. But I will say that that price on that card isn't always available, so depending on what time you're watching this video, those may have sold out or that sale price might not be currently available. So that's a bit of a headache there in that comparison. Anyway, so that's my overall thoughts on these. Of these 3 cards, if you're just looking at them in a vacuum head-to-head against each other, I think the 4060 non-Ti is the best value overall, because the other cards tend to be, when not VRAM limited, 20 to 25% faster. And for the 8GB 4060 Ti, you're spending closer to 30% more money. And there's not such a massive performance difference that you get like a completely different experience. And again, I'm a little more forgiving of 8GB of VRAM at $280 than I am at $370 or so. Anyway, it has that going for it. But like I said, not a huge fan of any of these products, but this is how they currently look, what they're currently priced. And again, they do run the latest games at 1080p and 1440p at reasonable adjusted settings. So they do have that going for it. I don't think you'll have a miserable experience using any of them. But again, like I said, I have a lot of thoughts on their overall value, but I've already said that. So I hope you guys found the video useful and or interesting. Huge thank you to viewers, subscribers, channel members who have clicked the join button down below to directly fund the channel financially. That is absolutely huge to get that support. As a thank you, I offer membership badges on comments. Also makes it easier for me to find and reply to your comments. And I offer early access to some content. This video itself is probably going up a week before I actually end up posting it, because I posted something else today that was more time sensitive. So a lot of times I have some videos ready that are less time sensitive to some kind of news video, and you get early access to a bunch of content. Or if I know I'm going to be busy for a while, sometimes I make a few videos ahead of time, you get early access. There's some exclusive behind the scenes content that's more just talking about plans or other things that just wouldn't make sense on the main channel. I never paywall anything permanently that would be something that would make sense to publish into the main feed or anything like that, but it's a way of thanking channel members to give them early access to stuff as it becomes available. And I hope everybody has an excellent day. Totally understand not everybody's in a financial position to be financially supporting the channel. That's totally fine. You're all beautiful people, and I hope you have an excellent day.